Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Crime Centric. This being a show where it's about crime dramas that I watch. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Prodigal Son. A great episode. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. I do love that, obviously, the Whitley family is kind of excited, thinking like, okay, things are a little more okay because, hey, Birdie's gone, so we don't have to talk about in codes and stuff like that anymore. So, you know, Jessica's like, dinner at 8, it was like dinner at 7, and Malcolm's like, I'll be there at 8 or something like that. So it's like they're kind of letting their guard down a little bit, and I like how that coincides with, you know, just when they kind of like, we dodged a bullet, to, oh yeah, because also there's a conversation about like, she's like, yeah, because Jessica wants his family, because like, oh, I know things between you and, Ainsley haven't been that well. He's like, nah, like, we had our issue, but it was like, it's fine. It's like, no, looking back on it, reminding you, right, she manipulated you and was kind of a little sadistic about it. So he's kind of like, yeah, she kind of, basically was kind of saying something in the veins of like, yeah, she made herself hurt or something like that. But I thought it was interesting too, like the opening where we kind of cut back between Malcolm's morning routine and Simon Huxley's. And obviously for him to kind of butt in an investigation, and it's like, oh, I love immediately JT knows who he is. It's like, oh yeah, you're the mind sleuth, and it's like, oh, that, you know, it's like, oh, you've read my book, meaning you're something, the brawn of the group, but you're also the brains of something. He's like, well, I can't disagree with you on that. And then also when he introduced himself to Den, he's like, Enchante, and she's like, no, and pulls her hand away. But also, like, he pokes the bear in many different regards. Like, Gil, Arroyo, you're the one who took in Martin Whitley's son and made him your protege. And, oh, here's Malcolm Bright. You look at murder so personally, but to be fair, considering your family's circumstances, of course murder is going to be very personal to you. So he's the one that kind of discovers, like, Holly's murder isn't personal. And it's like, you could not say that it was not preferred. The fact is, it's like how you jump from, oh, it's not personal to it being a professional hit unless you have prior information, because it turns out there have been other deaths, and obviously Malcolm looks into it later on and finds out, him and Ainsley look into it later on and find out, there's been a string of murders all connected to people who has something to do with Nicholas Endicott's disposal. And I thought that was so interesting to bring that back, because that's a question I have been asked, like, how did you get the body to Estonia? It's like, that's the question. And so, like, that's so interesting. Now it's like everyone who's associated with disposing of the body is now getting killed. I even love, like, obviously the way he, like, you know, even Ainsley, as calm and cool and collected, her being like, oh, we get away with murder and stuff like that. And then, like, even she's just kind of like irritated by the fact is Simon kind of shows up acting like he knows what's what, the way he's poking at Malcolm, the way he's poking at her, and eventually, like, he makes his way around to all the different Whitleys at some point in time, and is kind of poking, because he knows something's up. He can almost taste it. He's kind of figured it out, and now it's up to Malcolm to basically try and stay one step ahead of Simon when it comes to all this, because obviously because of the way things are, it's not like Malcolm knows everyone that was involved, you know, because for him it's like, it turns out he used Nicholas's own connection, so he made a call on Nicholas's phone to have someone pick something up, so they didn't know what they were dealing with. They didn't realize, hey, the boss that you thought called you was actually the thing that you were disposing of. And so Malcolm thought it was the cleanest way, but now it's like, nope, it's coming back and everyone involved is being killed. So now it's up to Malcolm to try and stay one step ahead of Simon, because I think there is this professional animosity he has towards Simon, because later on it's like, oh, what he does is a magic trick, and then JT's like, okay, so when you do it, it's real, but when he does it, it's a magic trick. And it's like, you know, and I love that Danny kind of calls him out. It's like, oh yeah, that's easy for you to say, JT, considering like you're a fan, you read the book and everything. It's like, you know what Malcolm needs? A moniker. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I don't think they found anything that necessarily would stick. But at the same time, Gil is getting like grilled too, because it's like, oh, considering your relationship, obviously you have a personal relationship with Jessica. It's like, yeah, so did you kill? He's like, yeah, I killed Endicott when I was bleeding out or during my surgery. Yeah, at any point in time. But he's like, because there's something between you and Jessica was manipulated by this man. You probably want to get revenge, so you're both in on it. So he's grasping at straws, but there is some motive behind some of those straws he's kind of tugging at. So I thought that was interesting. You know, in retrospect, I think that's kind of interesting. Throughout this episode, the only person he never talked to one-on-one, with the exception of the ending and like at the beginning, was Ainsley. He never had an extended one-on-one with her, like in the vein of the investigation. Another person I was kind of sad we never got to see an interaction between them was Huxley and Idrissa. I would have loved to know what those conversations are going to be like. Is she a fan? Could that be something they bring up next episode? It's like, oh my god, I miss Huxley. Oh man, I'm a big fan of the Mind Slough. That'd be kind of neat if they kind of bring something up like that. I think that'd be pretty interesting. But I also love that conversation with Martin where he was kind of like excited at being like, oh, we got some agent investigating and stuff like, yeah, who's the agent? And it's like, yeah, it's Simon Huxley, and it's like, oh, he asked for an interview, but I turned her down because I wasn't interested. I love that he makes such a point of it. It's like, oh, this is because he's considered as, I think, was it Danny that says it, I believe? That's like, oh yeah, he's like a modern day Sherlock Holmes or whatever. Nevertheless, I thought that was so interesting. But also, it's like, oh yeah, he's got perfect this, perfect that, perfect teeth for Brit, which makes that, obviously the line is funny because both Tom Paine and Martin Sheen are both British. In particular, if I'm not mistaken, I believe Martin Sheen's Welsh, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm being more specific. But I just, it's like they wrote that line specifically for that. It's kind of, which I don't know, I think it's just like, I guess that's supposed to be kind of like a wink, wink, nudge, inside joke to a certain extent. But, obviously, Malcolm can think ruthlessly, but he doesn't know how to act ruthlessly. Because at first it's kind of like, well, we could just let who's ever killing these people just kill this last person. But Malcolm's like, I can't, because he actually met the last part of the chain. It was a girl that seemed very innocent to him. It's like, oh, this is another person that got manipulated by Endicott. So it's like, he's like, we all know kind of how Endicott manipulates people. Well, that conversation kind of comes up later on about how he handles young women and kind of ruins their lives and stuff and kind of manipulates them and uses them. And, just a terrible human being that he was. But I think that's why, like, Malcolm looked at it as like, oh, this is an innocent person that I'm potentially going to get killed. She was just kind of an innocent bystander of just like, I got mixed up in this and now I got to do this. And it's like, you didn't even know what you were transporting and now you're going to die because of it. So Malcolm feels personally responsible considering all those deaths in his own mind. It's like, yeah, they're part of Endicott's system. Yeah, they're not the best people anyway, but consider who Endicott is. All those people could have been innocent people. I mean, to be fair, even Holly, it's like, yeah, she was doing some shady stuff on the side. Was it worthy of being murdered? No, but still it's a thing of like, not like they're innocent, but that's the whole thing of splitting hairs. It's like, yeah, Malcolm still has all those deaths on his hand because it's like, right, and in particular, I think for him, it's like, at the very least, I'm the one that jump-started all this by trying to dispose of Endicott's body. I want to at least save one person from all of this. So obviously he shows up at that crime scene, finds Brian's dead body, and he's like, okay. At first I didn't get what he was doing with the whole cutting off his thumb thing. I was like, is that supposed to divert the investigation? To a certain extent, but it was also like, oh, he needs his thumb to access the Brian's phone to find the lady, which we later on find her name is Natalie. It was like trying to get access to that. I was like, oh, that's so fascinating. Once again, the back and forth, anytime they're in a scene together, and I love that moment later on, Danny's like, oh, look at you two, agreeing on things. Because it's like, yeah, one of them will suggest something, the other one was like, oh, I was just about to say the same thing. Oh, you too. It's just like this little snarky, like, he knows, and he, like, Huxley knows, and he kind of knows that Malcolm knows that he knows. So it's just kind of like this, like, and Alan Cumming is so good at just that, like, smug. He's got that smug, like, oh, I'm smarter than you, I've got it all figured out. Look, like, I just like that look. He plays it. He's so, obviously, like, we know he's kind of a good guy in this, but it's also just, like, how smug he is. Because it's always that interesting thing. It's, like, it's a very, like, Light and L situation for me, like a very Death Note, bringing it back to anime, because it's like Light, the same thing can apply with Walter White. It's that thing of a villain, you want them to get away with what they're doing, even though you're like, I mean, Malcolm isn't a Light and he's not a Walter White, but the fact of the matter is, it is a situation of you kind of done something bad, but here's this, like, truth be told, is good guy, because in this particular episode you can make the argument that he's the antagonist, sure, but if you flip the perspective that this was a different show, Huxley would be the protagonist, and Malcolm would be the antagonist, very much like Death Note. If you flip the story around, like, you can shift L and Light's positions as protagonist and antagonist, depending on the perspective of the story. It's only like Light as a protagonist because you follow him through the story. It's the same thing like Malcolm, like, but it's like he's impeding the investigation and stuff like that. So he would be the adversary. He would be, I guess like with the Sherlock comparison, he'd be kind of the Moriarty, I guess, to a certain extent. Regardless, I'm going to this huge tangent and stuff like that, but I just think that's such an interesting like thing you can think about with a story like this. It's just like if you flip the perspective, you'd be like, yeah, take Malcolm down. He's covering up a crime. It's like, but because we're on Malcolm's side, understanding the circumstances of it, and we followed him as a protagonist, we're like, no, Malcolm, you got to cover this up. You know, I mean, at this point in time, you're so deep in it, you just got to keep digging deeper and deeper into the circumstances. So I just thought that was like a fascinating element to it. You had him confronting Jessica, and like there's that kind of playful back and forth that they have, but he kind of calls her out, and she's like, because for him, he pokes at her by being like, saying what so many people have already said before, like, oh my God, you got fooled again. Oh, look at Jessica Whitley, like, just surrounded by terrible men. It's like, oh, first your husband, now Nicholas. It's like, oh, you were played the fool again, and she didn't appreciate it. It's like, okay, you want to say that I'm the killer? At one point, could I have done that when I was with Gil? Like, oh, did I come here and kill him in my own room? And you saw Huxley kind of perk up a little bit, and it's like, now, why'd you specifically say here? And she's like, I was just, and it's like she slipped up. That's always a complicated thing. And those when you're trying to kick, like in the heat of the moment, because he pressed your buttons, you drop some information, like because it's like you could have referenced anywhere, but you specifically referenced this room, and it's like, oh, looking at the rug, that rug looks like it's been here for a while. That one looks newer, so. And obviously Jessica asked him to leave, but then like family meeting and everything. And I thought it was so interesting because it's like, you know, he's like, you should have called me. She's like, yeah, if I called you, it would have been super suspicious. And it's like, you know, obviously Ainsley's the one that's the most annoyed by it. And it's just like, for her, it's a situation of, well, I think we're doing kind of okay with this whole getting away with murder thing. And even Jessica's like, do you even hear yourself? And like, because at first it's like, well, Malcolm, we know what was up if you let us in. He's like, all right, you want me to let you in? I'm lying to my team, and I've got a thumb in my freezer. And Ainsley's like, wait, what? And Jessica's like, I don't need to know that. He's like, well, I'm just, you know, feeling you in, Mom. So it's a situation of, you know, his hands start shaking, and then even Jessica, they're like, Ainsley, like, look what you're doing to your brother. And I think for the first time, she kind of looked and was like, oh, I get it. But you can still, once again, that's a psychotic answer of like, oh, at least we're getting away with them. Like, she's almost showing like no concern. Like she is, but it almost feels non-genuine concern of almost like, I think on some level there's some part of her that's kind of like, oh, I don't want to get caught, but I'm kind of enjoying this. Like, I think we're going to get away with it. Like, I don't know, her cockiness about it. It's like, you committed one murder. You didn't even do it on purpose. You did it on like, you blacked out. So it's almost like, it's weird that you're kind of getting cocky about something like you're like, I don't know, it's like on some level, it's almost like, oh, I'm like my dad. It's like, you know, you're about 22 bodies short. And once again, he did that actively. You did that subconsciously. You had kind of, were in a trance. You kind of blacked out during it. So it's just, I don't know, her behavior about it. Once again, like, we've seen that shift even last episode, the way she treated Malcolm and manipulated him. It's like, oh, like her doing what she did last episode. It's kind of a dick move. Not just kind of a severe dick move, that it's just like her kind of having that same attitude and stuff. It's almost like, I think she's going to be the chain that kind of causes this whole thing to kind of explode. And she might be the liability, just being who she, I don't know. So there's that. Then there's an interesting confrontation between Huxley and Whitley. He's trying to pretend like he doesn't know, like, oh, you're the mind sleuth. He's coming up with all these other names and stuff like that. And Huxley is kind of poking at him about the fact is because he figures out like, oh, wait, there's a glimmer in you. It's like, I know who it was. It was your son. Ironically, it wasn't his son that did it, because at first he's like, there's no way this family did it because none of them had the killer instinct like you did. So you coached them through it, like how to kill him, how to dispose of the body. But then it's like this glimmer of like, oh, you were kind of proud, like fatherly pride. It's like, it's because of your son, Malcolm, and stuff like that. He knows it's like a family affair, but he particularly points out that it was Malcolm, which is sad considering Malcolm was not the one, but he's the easiest one to draw the conclusion to, like, hey, which is interesting considering, like, oh, he was a suspect in like this penultimate episode and the season finale, like the whole suspect, but it ended up being like, and the cop behind it and everything. So it's interesting to be him being on the suspect pool again. But and I think that speaks volumes where immediately, like, because he feels that Martin will only have that pride towards Malcolm. To be fair, his pride stems from Malcolm disposing of the body and stuff like that. And it's like, oh, you don't know anything. But then, like, him getting a little close and kind of, it's like, oh, I want you to know when I, like, lock your son up and he's going to be like a pathetic husk just like you or something like that. And obviously, Martin had the scissors. And it's like, that's the thing of, like, there's that whole conversation between him and Capshaw, which I think is so interesting, where she's kind of calling him out of like, oh, you're really sorry about my patient dying? You've killed 23 people. He's like, yes. not on the operating table. He's like, I separate pleasure, business with pleasure. So it is a thing of like he has like. Once again, it's a crazy thing of like, yes, he's the psychotic killer that he is, but he still does love his family. Granted, he wished Malcolm would make things easier by being like, oh, just let whoever's behind all this kill everyone and we tie this up nicely. He's like, I can't let that happen. He's just like, oh my God, Malcolm, you're so frustrated. He's like, all right, son, sure. It's just like, he's so frustrated because it's like, we could have, if you just give in, son, and be more like me, oh my God, we'd have an easy, fun time with this. But it's like, no, you have to make things difficult. You have to have a conscience, you know? So I just thought that was interesting. And even the fact is that I had a feeling Capshaw was trying to be there to help Martin, even kind of telling Huxley, like, oh, leave, or my boss told me I could kick your ass out, like, or I could get fired. And it's like, oh, they decided I'm still here, so I didn't get fired, so you need to get the hell out of here. So, but obviously, it's like seeing Martin so pissed off like that because he does care about his family, and also just saying like, "Stay away from my family." It's like, once again, it is interesting that he is so protective of them. But I guess it makes sense in a grand scheme of things. But there's also the conversation he has with Malcolm, who I like that whole thing of like, all right, you gotta like. There has to be electrical current going through the thumb first, because it's electric signals in the thumb that actually unlock the phone, not just the thumb itself. I thought that was kind of an interesting tidbit of information. Not like I'm applying that to the real world, but it was just like, oh, that's interesting in a creepy, morbid way. But still, he was able to get the information, but then, you have Huxley confronting, in which Malcolm turns the tides on him by being like, oh, you're coming, like, the only reason why you care about this Endicott thing is because your books are kind of in the bargain bin, that you basically haven't solved the case in such a long time. It's been a couple years. Yeah, you had the perfect record and stuff like that, but you were hoping this case would put you back on the map, kind of get you back in the starlight and stuff like that. But also, Huxley is kind of poking at him, because it's like, oh, you want to have this sword like you're in White Knight. It's like, yeah, it's dull, but it's for piercing armor. And it's like, yeah, you think you're like this White Knight, but you'll never be a White Knight, kind of calling him out like that. Because that's Malcolm's biggest concern, is ever becoming like his dad. That's always been his biggest fear and concern. And even Huxley being like, you're still that scared little boy looking for daddy's love. And it's just like, poked a lot of nerves. Malcolm meets up with Natalie later on, and she's kind of like, whoa, like, this is your fault for killing that dude in the car, blah, blah, blah. And then Malcolm notices, like, oh, we're not going to, wait, were we supposed to? And it's like, wait, we're past that too. And it's like, and he pieces it together. It's like, you're the one behind everything. And it's like, you're not the last link in the chain, you're the head of the chain. And then her expression changes, and it's like, yep. So she's killed everybody to cover her own tracks. I guess maybe Huxley was already looking into, or I don't know. Maybe, I guess in the moment she found out it was Endicott that was dead, she didn't want to have anyone. Because we never actually heard what made her start killing everybody. I guess either it being Endicott that was found dead and that's what sparked everything, or maybe it's just a situation in general. I don't know. Like, why now? Why not sooner? I mean, because we don't know how long. Obviously, Endicott's body was disposed of last year, so sometime in that frame between his body being disposed of and now, like, she started killing people. Whether it was a more recent thing or whether it's been over the course of that sometime in that year frame that she started doing it. But we never kind of found out like why she started, other than like trying to protect herself. And I think, obviously that being the irony behind it, that Malcolm didn't see her for who she was. The fact is, he looked at her as like someone innocent. But to be fair, once again, it's that situation of another person that was kind of caught up in Endicott's web and was kind of owed him. So she's trying to protect herself. Even telling Malcolm is like, yeah, I'm kind of doing both of us a favor by getting rid of Huxley. But Malcolm manages to get there first, and it's like, okay, I'm trying to save you. That's Natalie. She's the head of the snake. And I love a lot of Huxley's lines at the end being like, oh, I'm about to be killed by a millennial. What was it, like the irony or something like, oh, the twist. And then also him getting shot, and he's like, oh, I don't want to die in Brooklyn. And it's like, don't you have a gun? Don't you have a gun? He's like, I'm British, which is funny considering, like, no, you're actually, because I didn't, like, I might have brought this up in last episode. I didn't know this. Alan Cumming's Scottish. I've never heard his natural accent until like I want to say maybe last year. So the first time, because anything I've ever seen him in, he's always had an American accent. So I never knew that, but yeah, he's Scottish, I believe. Yeah. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. And so Malcolm deals with the whole Natalie thing, and obviously at one point she's falling, and he's offering like, just drop the gun and help you. She's like, but how do I know you're going to actually help? He's just like, you got to trust me. But in that moment she couldn't. Like, it's, you know, her survival instincts kick in. She tries to shoot and falls and gets impaled. You know, that is the sad thing, because for Malcolm it's like, once again, doesn't really go into it, but he does blame himself, because like all this death, it's kind of on him. Like, he's the one that got disposed of Endicott's body, and that led all this happening. To be fair, it all goes back to Endicott anyway. He's the reason all this kind of got played out. Even to the point, it's like, you know, he's talking to Gil, he's like, because it's like all the blame is falling on Natalie, that she's the one responsible, and he's like, and he kind of sobs. It's like, I tried to save her, and Gil's like, no, I know. Don't beat yourself up about it, but it makes him feel even more guilty about the whole situation, because I think on some level he's probably going to start questioning himself. Was I really willing to save her? Because I think for him it's like letting her die would have been the easier thing, and so for him it's like he probably tried to overcorrect, because it's like, I can't let her die, because it's just going to feed that darkness in me if I just kind of excuse myself to be like, yeah, I can do this. So I was actually really surprised when it comes to Simon being like, yeah, I guess, you know, I thought we were going to have a twist at the very end where he was like, oh, you think you're going to get me off the case that easily? I know it's really you. You're covering your tracks or something like that. But it's like, no, he believes the new narrative that's being created. And, you know, it's like, you know, Malcolm's like, no, I didn't help solve anything. I was just kind of a side character in this. And it's like, yeah, the snake eating its own tail, which he's like, oh, I can use that for my next book. And it's like, go right ahead. Oh, I can help you out. Gets him in front of Ainsley and stuff like that. So I was actually surprised. Doesn't mean he can't pop up later on, but I think that's so fascinating that this was dealt with in like one episode. Granted, he popped up at the end of last episode, so for it to be over now, granted, the character exists. He can always be a thorn in your side later on. I don't know. It seems like that was resolved, but you can always have a thing later on when they work on another case together, because even Gil's like, oh yeah, you can come back anytime, just call first. And he's like, oh, I'll try to do that. So it seems like everything kind of got resolved on that front. But there is the thing at the end where it's like, yeah, good job getting away with murder, guys. And it's just like Malcolm and Jessica are just like, ugh. And it's like, you know, celebrating keeping the family together. So that's kind of like the main thing. So other than that, we get the situation with Capshaw and her sneaking into Martin's room. It came as no surprise to me, because I'm like, the moment, like, was it last episode that happened? I was like, dude, that's totally gonna be a thing. Like, she's obsessed with him now. What was interesting was like the power dynamic this episode, where she was like, now clean that up, and it's just like she was kind of taking charge, like, oh, I'm the one in charge, and being so smug. And I think maybe on some level, Martin kind of likes it. Because I think for some people, everyone in his life, he's always kind of been the more powerful person. Whether it's he's always over his son, he's always over his daughter, he's always been over his victims, or, you know, the people that are on his table, like their lives are in his hands. So it's like narcissistic God complex type of thing. So he's always been above someone. So I think on some level, for someone to make him feel smaller, I think he kind of likes it. He likes someone taking charge who's not afraid to take charge of him. I think he likes being a little submissive when it comes to her. And she's like, oh yeah, my knife, my scissors, can I have them back? And he's like, I have no idea. She's like, oh, come on, you know, I know you, and don't kind of underestimate me. And he willfully gives it over, and she's like, thank you, touches his hands, and they kiss. I'm like, I knew it. Because I had a feeling like, well, I don't know whether it was, you know, like the people that write letters to serial killers, because like, oh my god, we're so in love. I kind of got that vibe from her last episode, because it just seemed like they were hitting it off. The candy, the butterscotch candy she gave him and everything. But then like she kind of flipped on him this episode. But I was also like, I think it's like a power play to be like, oh yeah, bring you in, but then also like put my heels to your neck and be like, no, you do what I say, good boy, you know, like kind of like a pet. So definitely going to be an interesting dynamic. Like I said, I believe it was last episode I was kind of saying that she's going to be the one that ends up ultimately helping him escape, and they might go on a run. Maybe her and Whitley and also Martin, and then maybe Ainsley. Then we might have a situation where like, oh, they're close together and stuff like that, and then Ainsley might decide to kill her just because it's like, oh, you're no longer needed, or Martin decides to kill her because she's no longer needed, or it could just be it's like, oh, a father-daughter trip, then we want to run thing. That was kind of my big suggestion, potentially where things could go. We'll see whether that still ends up being a case or not, but I'm so curious to see where her story ends up taking her. This, you know, sitting here thinking about it, it's a very you situation. There's even a similar, I won't go into it if you haven't seen it, but like there is a very similar circumstance in season 2 of The Punisher, that's kind of similar to that very like you relationship in that regard. That's kind of spoilers a little bit to a certain extent, but it's like I'm interested to see what that story. I don't think it's going to have the happy ending that maybe she thinks it does, but you never know what that's. I'm curious to see what that means for Martin. Like, what's his disposition going to be like now? Is he going to be like extra chipper or what? He's always kind of got this chipper disposition, but I think even more so because of this. It's definitely going to be interesting to see where everything kind of goes, because obviously the Whitley family avoided one hurdle, but you know it's not over, because this is always going to be looming over their heads. Yes, it's all on Natalie, but you know something's going to come up later on that kind of bring this all back, that maybe things aren't settled. I don't know what that necessary thing would be. I don't think it'll be Huxley. Maybe it will. Maybe he'll stumble across something that comes his way and that'll bring him back into the story, or maybe it's just something or someone else that kind of comes to the forefront. We'll ultimately have to wait and see. I'm really interested to see where all this ends up taking us. I'm glad to have Prodigal Son back. I'm so interested to see where the rest of this season ultimately ends up taking us. We'll have to wait and see where the next episode takes us with all of this, but really that's all I'm going to talk about. So next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.